Hey, it's Darryl Sims, and in today's lesson we're going to be talking about intervals, simple intervals, compound intervals. This is very important stuff if you want to communicate as a musician and develop your theory knowledge. I refer a lot to intervals throughout all of my theory lessons. If you're not yet familiar with the names that we give intervals as musicians and their values, their importance, their numbers, qualities, things like that, then listen up because this is very important stuff. Let's get cracking. So let's start off with some real basic stuff. If you already have a kind of okay understanding of what intervals are and how they work, then maybe you want to skip ahead a few minutes to the latter part of the video where I talk about compound intervals, 13ths, 14ths, things like that. But for those who are new to intervals, let's make a start on some real easy stuff right now. Now you may already know that in music there are essentially 12 notes in total. So for example, we have an open E string here, and then on the 12th fret, we have the same note. They're both E's. This one here is just an octave above the open string. Octave is a term that we use for the same note, but just 12 semitones higher than the initial note that you're going for. So we can do the same with a C here. We have a C on the 3rd fret of the A string. And then if we go up to 15, that's 12 frets up. It's the same note. Now we're going to be working with C in this demonstration since C is one of the easier keys to understand since it has no sharps or flats. Now between this C and this C, there are 7 main notes, and that is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. If you knew that already, then congratulations, you know your alphabet. But what's really important to take note of here is that there are 7 main notes in music, therefore 7 intervals that we need to learn, and we need to learn their qualities. So there's 2 variables there, both their number and their quality. And their qualities can be either major, minor, perfect, diminished, or augmented. That is 5 interval types that we're going to be talking about over these 7 notes. So to begin with, we're going to play all of the major and perfect intervals from C to C. So that would be your root note, your major second, major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major 6, major 7, and then your octave. That may sound familiar to you. That's just your C major scale, which consists of all perfect and major intervals. We can also play that shape vertically. It would sound like this. This shape is a very common shape as a guitar player, so make sure you're very aware of that and where the perfect and the major intervals are. Next up, let's put together the minor and the perfect intervals. So in the key of C again, we would have your root, minor second. So you'll notice that the difference between a minor and major here is just a half step down. So we've got root, minor second, minor third, again just a half step down from that major third. We have our perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor 6, minor 7, and then your octave. And again, if we played that shape vertically, it would sound like this. Now interestingly, this doesn't actually spell the natural typical minor scale. This is a minor scale. It's actually a mode of the major scale, which is for another lesson. But for those curious, the technical name for this is Phrygian. As you may be able to hear, it's a very dark sounding mode, which isn't a surprise since the majority of the notes are built from minor notes. So you can see already that apart from our root, our octave, and our perfect notes, we have a minor and a major second, minor, major third, minor, major 6, and a minor and major 7. 2, 3, 6, and 7. Those 4 notes contain both major and minor variations. Your perfect intervals will always be number 4 and 5, which in the key of C is going to be F and G. Now there are 2 more note qualities to talk about, and that is diminished and augmented. So an augmented note is a note that's 1 semitone above a major or a perfect interval, and a diminished is kind of the opposite, where it's 1 semitone below a perfect or a minor interval. So the most common augmented and diminished interval that you will ever encounter sits between the perfect 4 and the perfect 5. It has 2 names depending on its context. It could either be an augmented fourth, since it sits 1 semitone above the 4, Or it could be a diminished fifth, since it sits one semitone before the fifth. More than often we'll refer to this note as the diminished fifth, since that's just what we use more of in the context. But just be aware that there are two names for this, and similarly there are at least two names for the majority of notes. So as an example, in the key of C, this note here is your minor third, but it could also be seen as your augmented second. And the reason for that is because it's one semitone above your major second. Similarly, if we went the other way and we played this note here, well, this would be your major second, but it could be your diminished third, since it's one semitone below the minor third. Now again, this is just something to be aware of, since this terminology isn't the most common, because more than often we would refer to this note as a major second or a minor third versus an augmented second or a diminished third. It does go quite a bit deeper than this, but this is a great introduction to learning the interval values, numbers, qualities, things like that. So you should now be familiar with the 12 interval names, both horizontally and vertically on the guitar, using this shape. Now there's one more sort of terminology that I want you to get familiar with, and that's flattened, natural, and sharpened notes. Now you'll find that of all these 12 notes, the root note, the major intervals, and the perfect intervals are your numbers. So you just have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, as we spoke about earlier. But between that, we can of course have 1, flat 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7, and then your octave. Similarly here, you could also have sharpened intervals, which takes the same principle, just one semitone above the natural notes. So we would have root, sharp 2, sharp 3, which is actually the same as your perfect 4, sharp 4, sharp 5, which is the same as your minor 6, sharp 6, and then sharp 7, which is the same as your octave. So again, you'll notice that there can be multiple names for certain notes, but in most contexts, we don't have a sharp 3, since that's just a 4, or a sharp 7, since that's your root note again. However, it does depend on the context, and you'll become more familiar and aware of this as you progress as a musician. Now that's just about everything that I want to cover with simple intervals being within a 1 octave span. So get familiar with that both horizontally and vertically. You can take that major shape and use that as your template. Remember that this is just your 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 1, major 2, major 3, perfect 4, perfect 5th, major 6, major 7. That's always going to be your go-to template, and then you can flatten intervals or change them to your minor variations or augmented, diminished, perfect, whatever it is you're trying to do from here. Remember that this is in the key of C, but this shape is transferable anywhere across the neck. As is your horizontal shape, you just need to really pay attention to what you're doing, since it's not as easy to work horizontally as it is to work vertically, since this is all within a simple finger range here. Take your time with that, get familiar with it. It's very, very important. For those of you who followed along so far and found that relatively easy, let's briefly talk about compound intervals, which means intervals that extend beyond that 1 octave span. You may have heard of these before, such as your 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and so on. Now, since there are only 7 intervals in total, that would mean that, once again, you have more names to think about here, since a 9, for example, is the same as a 2. Since 8 is 1, let me give you a practical example here. We'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then this would be 1 or 8. And then if we continue that major scale, this would be number 2 or 9, 10 and 3, 11 or 4, 12 or 5, 13 or 6, and then as far on as you need to go. More than often you won't exceed 14, since that will require incredibly long fingers, and the distance between your original root note and anything beyond 15 is kind of just so far. But anyway, the same principles would follow here with the order of the minor, major, perfect, augmented, diminished intervals, only rather than call it your minor or major second, you would now call it your minor or major 9. Now the reason that we use this terminology rather than the simple 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 is to make it clear which sort of octave we're aiming for. So for example, a second would be a lot closer to the root than a 9. despite them being the same note, one is just farther away than the other. So there we go. That was a lot of information, but I really hope that you managed to take some points in and that you didn't find it too boring. But as I said, this is really, really important stuff. So it's really important that you actually just sit down and study this. Study the diagrams that I shared in this video to really memorize the different interval qualities and the numbers. If you want to support more content like this and download a transcript for this lesson, then make sure you check out my Patreon page, which is linked in the description below. And until next time, I will see you in the next video.